The rancher stood in the ashes of everything he'd built, watching flames devour his barn while his mail-order bride, arrived just 30 days ago, faced down the armed men who'd set the fire. Lydia Hale wasn't supposed to be here. She was supposed to have quit and left weeks ago, like any sensible woman would. Instead, she stood between Ethan Cade and Victor Rourke's hired guns, a rifle steady in her hands, her voice cutting through the smoke. "You want this land? You'll have to go through both of us." This is their story of fire, fraud, and the woman who refused to run. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The Montana sky burned red the afternoon Ethan Cade rode into the stage stop, dust trailing behind his horse like a ghost he couldn't shake. 6 years of war, 3 years of clawing a ranch from unforgiving soil, and now this, waiting for a woman he'd never met, bought with words written in desperation on winter nights when the loneliness felt heavier than the snow. He'd told himself 100 times he was a fool. Mail-order brides were for desperate men, and Ethan Cade had sworn never to be desperate again. But the ranch didn't care about pride. The cattle needed tending, the fences needed mending, and the brutal Montana winters didn't wait for a man to find companionship the traditional way. He'd written the letter 3 months ago, half drunk on whiskey and wholly convinced no woman would actually answer. But one had. Lydia Hale, from Boston. 26 years old, educated, and by her own account, seeking a new beginning in the Western Territories. The words had been proper, almost formal, revealing nothing of the woman who'd written them. Ethan had responded with equal caution, laying out the harsh truth. The ranch was isolated, the work was brutal, the winters could kill, and he was a scarred man with little to offer beyond hard work and honest intentions. She'd written back anyway. Now, watching the stagecoach materialize through the heat shimmer on the horizon, Ethan felt his gut tighten with something between dread and reluctant hope. He'd pictured her a dozen different ways, timid, fragile, already regretting her decision the moment she saw the raw frontier town of Silver Ridge. The stage rolled to a stop in a cloud of dust, the horses snorting and stamping. The driver, a grizzled man named Hoskins, climbed down and shot Ethan a knowing grin. "Your package arrived safe and sound, Cade," Hoskins called out, pulling open the coach door. "Though I gotta say, this one's got more spine than most I've hauled out here." Ethan's brow furrowed. What's that supposed to mean? Before Hoskins could answer, a woman stepped down from the coach, and every assumption Ethan had made shattered like glass. Lydia Hale wasn't what he expected. She was tall, nearly as tall as some of the ranch hands he'd employed over the years. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her traveling dress, though dusty from the journey, was well made and sensible rather than fashionable. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold, sharp, assessing, and utterly without fear as they swept across the rough frontier town and then settled on him. "Mr. Cade, I presume," she said, her voice clear and direct, carrying a hint of Eastern education, but none of the weakness he'd expected. Ethan dismounted, acutely aware of his worn boots, sun-weathered face, and the scar that ran along his left jaw, a gift from Shiloh that he'd carried for 6 years. "Ma'am," he managed, touching the brim of his hat. "Welcome to Silver Ridge." "Thank you." She glanced around the dusty street, taking in the handful of rough buildings, the saloon with its peeling paint, the general store with its crooked sign. If she was disappointed, her face didn't show it. "It's exactly as you described in your letters." "I appreciate honesty, Mr. Cade." Hoskins hauled down her trunk, a single, well-worn piece that suggested she'd traveled light and practical. Lydia moved to help him, reaching for one of the handles before Ethan could react. "Ma'am, I'm quite capable of carrying my own belongings, Mr. Cade," she interrupted, not unkindly but with unmistakable firmness. "I've hauled this trunk from Boston to St. Louis to here. I think I can manage a few more feet." Hoskins caught Ethan's eye and smirked. "Told you, spine." Together, they carried the trunk to Ethan's wagon, a rough utilitarian vehicle designed for hauling supplies, not impressing ladies. Lydia examined it without comment, then turned to face him directly. "Before we go any further, Mr. Cade, I think we should speak plainly." Ethan felt the walls go up instinctively. Here it came, the moment she'd realized her mistake and asked for passage back east. "All right." "I didn't come here under false pretenses," Lydia said, her gaze steady. "I read your letters carefully. I understand the ranch is remote, the work is difficult, and Montana winters are unforgiving. I also understand that you are a man who values honesty and hard work over pretty words and false promises." "That's right." "Then you should know I feel the same way." She crossed her arms, her stance more suited to a business negotiation than a marriage arrangement. "I didn't leave Boston on a whim, Mr. Cade. I left because I was suffocating in a world that valued appearance over substance, lineage over ability, and expected me to marry a man I despised simply because our families deemed it appropriate." Ethan blinked. That hadn't been in her letters. "I can read, write, and calculate figures," Lydia continued. "I've managed household accounts, negotiated with tradesmen, and spent 2 years helping my uncle run a dry goods business before he passed, and my family decided I should return to proper society. I know how to work, Mr. Cade, and I'm not afraid of it. But I also won't be treated like a piece of decoration or a servant who should be grateful for the privilege of scrubbing your floors." The bluntness should have offended him. Instead, Ethan felt something shift, a grudging respect for a woman who'd speak her mind rather than play games. "I never asked for decoration," he said slowly. "And I don't need a servant. The ranch hands do their share, and I do mine." "Good." Lydia's expression softened slightly. "Then perhaps we can come to an understanding." "What kind of understanding?" "You expected a wife," she said, "but neither of us truly knows the other. You could be a tyrant, a drunkard, or simply incompatible with me in ways we won't discover until we've signed papers that bind us permanently." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I'm none of those things." "I believe you," Lydia said, "but belief isn't the same as knowing. So I propose this. Give me 30 days. Let me work the ranch as an equal partner, not as your wife, not as your servant, but as someone pulling their weight alongside you. If at the end of 30 days I've proven incapable or unwilling, I'll leave without complaint. You can send me back east and we'll part ways with no hard feelings." "And if you don't fail?" Ethan asked, though he was certain she would. The ranch had broken stronger men than her. "Then you'll treat me as an equal when we discuss our future," Lydia said. "Not as a woman you purchased through correspondence, but as a partner who's earned the right to stand beside you." The proposition was insane. Ethan should have refused immediately. Women didn't work ranches like hired hands. They managed households, tended gardens, maybe helped with lighter chores. The idea of this educated Boston woman mucking stalls, mending fences, and braving Montana weather was absurd. But something in her eyes, that unflinching certainty, made him pause. And beneath the absurdity, a small bitter part of him wanted to see her try. Wanted to watch her realize the truth he'd learned the hard way. The frontier didn't care about determination or intelligence. It simply took and took until there was nothing left. 30 days, he said finally. You work alongside me in the hands. You pull your weight. No special treatment. No complaints. If you can't handle it, you leave. Agreed. And if you get hurt because you're too stubborn to admit you can't do something, then that's my responsibility, not yours, Lydia interrupted. I'm not a child, Mr. Cade. I can assess my own capabilities. Ethan almost smiled. Almost. We'll see. They shook hands, her grip firm and direct, and Ethan realized with a sinking feeling that he might have just made the biggest mistake of his life. The ride to the ranch took 2 hours, following a rough trail that wound through rolling grassland dotted with pine. Lydia sat beside him on the wagon bench, her posture straight despite the jolting ride, her eyes taking in everything, the distant mountains, the scattered cattle bearing his brand, the occasional homestead that marked where other settlers had tried to claim their piece of Montana. How many acres? She asked as they crested a ridge and the valley opened before them. 800, Ethan said. Some of it's deeded, some is open range I've claimed through use, enough to run about 500 head of cattle if the grass holds and the winter isn't too brutal. And how many do you have now? 342 last count, lost 53 last winter to cold and wolves. Lydia absorbed this without flinching. What's your primary market, beef or breeding stock? Ethan glanced at her, surprised by the question. Beef, mostly. I sell to the railhead in Helena twice a year, spring and fall. Some breeding stock to smaller ranchers, but the real money's in getting cattle to market before winter. And your profit margins? Now he was definitely staring. You always talk business with strangers? We're partners for the next 30 days, Mr. Cade, Lydia said. I need to understand what I'm partnering in. Fair enough. Ethan laid out the numbers, what it cost to run the ranch, what he earned from cattle sales, how much went back into feed, equipment, and hiring seasonal hands. Lydia listened intently, occasionally asking questions that revealed a sharper understanding of commerce than he'd expected. You're operating on thin margins, she observed as the ranch buildings came into view. Most ranchers are, Ethan replied. One bad winter, one disease outbreak, one drop in market prices, and everything falls apart. Then diversification might help. Have you considered— Ma'am, Ethan interrupted, pulling the wagon to a stop in front of the ranch house. Let's see if you survive your first day before we start reorganizing my operation. The ranch house was a simple structure, 2 stories, built from rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney. Functional, not beautiful. The barn stood nearby, larger and better maintained because Ethan had always prioritized his livestock over his own comfort. Beyond that, a scattering of outbuildings, a smokehouse, a root cellar, a bunkhouse for the hands, and a small stable. Lydia climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help and surveyed her new temporary home with the same assessing gaze she'd given Silver Ridge. It's well maintained, she said finally. The barn's in better condition than most I saw on the way here. Cattle don't care if my porch sags, Ethan said, hauling her trunk down. They care if the barn roof leaks. Practical. Lydia followed him to the house. I appreciate that. The interior was sparse. A main room with a fireplace, a kitchen area, a rough table and chairs, and a staircase leading to the second floor where Ethan's bedroom and a smaller guest room sat. Everything was clean but worn, functional but lacking any softness or decoration. Guest room's upstairs, Ethan said, setting her trunk at the base of the stairs. You'll have privacy, I won't— He cleared his throat. This arrangement is business. You'll be treated respectfully. I never doubted that, Lydia said. Your letters made your character clear, Mr. Cade. Ethan, he said gruffly, if we're going to be partners, might as well use first names. Lydia, she replied, extending her hand again. They shook, and for a moment the absurdity of the situation hit Ethan fully. This educated Eastern woman shaking hands like a business associate in his rough Montana ranch house, preparing to work cattle like a hired hand, all because she'd rather prove herself than accept a marriage based on letters and desperation. He was definitely going to regret this. The first test came at dawn the next morning. Ethan woke at his usual time, 4:30, when the sky was still more black than gray, and dressed quickly in the cold. He'd half expected to find Lydia still asleep, giving him an excuse to leave her behind for the morning work. Instead, when he descended the stairs, she was already in the kitchen, dressed in practical clothes she must have brought from Boston. Sturdy trousers, a work shirt, and boots that looked like they'd actually been worn before. Coffee's ready? She said, nodding toward the pot on the stove. I wasn't sure how you take it. Ethan stared. You're up. You said we start at dawn. It's nearly dawn. She poured 2 cups and handed him one. What's the plan for today? He'd planned to ease her in, maybe have her help with lighter chores around the house, get accustomed to ranch life gradually. But her expectant expression killed that idea before he could voice it. Fence repair, he said instead. North pasture. Some posts rotted over winter and cattle are starting to drift through. All right, what tools do we need? 20 minutes later, they were loading the wagon with posts, wire, hammers, and diggers. Ethan's ranch hand, a weather-beaten man named Coop, who'd worked the ranch for 2 years, emerged from the bunkhouse and froze at the sight of Lydia hefting a bundle of fence wire. Boss? Coop's eyes darted between them. You want me to handle that? Miss Hale's got it, Ethan said, watching as Lydia secured the wire without fumbling. She's working the ranch for the next month. Coop's expression suggested he thought Ethan had lost his mind, but he was smart enough not to say so. Yes, sir. North pasture? That's right. The ride out took 30 minutes, following a trail that became rougher the farther they got from the main buildings. Lydia sat in the back of the wagon, bracing herself against the jolts without complaint, her eyes scanning the landscape. When they reached the damaged fence line, Ethan climbed down and began unloading tools. Ever done fence work before? No, Lydia admitted, but I'm a quick learner. Show me. For the next hour, Ethan demonstrated how to dig post holes in the rocky Montana soil, how to set posts at the right depth and angle, how to string wire tight enough to hold without breaking. Lydia watched intently, asked pointed questions, and then took a post hole digger and started working. The ground was unforgiving. Within minutes, sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool morning air. Ethan waited for her to slow down, to complain, to ask for a break. She didn't. Instead, she adjusted her grip, found a rhythm, and kept digging. The hole wasn't perfect, a bit crooked, not quite deep enough, but it was a genuine effort, not a token gesture. That'll do, Ethan said, surprised. Set the post. They worked through the morning, the sun climbing higher and the temperature rising. Coop handled the heavy lifting, but Lydia kept pace with the other tasks, stringing wire, hammering staples, hauling tools. Her hands, soft from Boston life, blistered within the first hour. Ethan noticed her wince when she gripped the hammer but say nothing. By noon, they'd repaired 20 yards of fence. Ethan called a break and they sat in the wagon's shade, eating the simple lunch Lydia had packed before dawn: bread, cheese, and dried meat. Your hands are bleeding, Ethan observed, nodding at the raw patches on her palms. Lydia glanced down and shrugged. They'll toughen up. You should wrap them. I should finish the fence, she countered. How much more do we have? Ethan studied her, this stubborn, impossible woman who'd rather bleed than quit. Another 40 yards, but you don't have to— Yes, I do, Lydia interrupted. We agreed. I pull my weight. Coop, chewing his lunch, muttered something that might have been Lord help us, or possibly stubborn fool. Ethan couldn't tell which, and it didn't matter because Lydia was already standing up, pulling on her gloves despite the pain, ready to get back to work. They finished the fence by mid-afternoon. Lydia's movements had slowed, her breathing was labored, and blood had seeped through her gloves in a few places. But she'd completed every task Ethan had given her without complaint. On the ride back, she sat silently, her face pale with exhaustion, but her expression still determined. You did good work today, Ethan said quietly as the ranch buildings came into view. Lydia looked at him, surprised. Thank you. But you need to take care of those hands, or you'll get infection. I will. And tomorrow's going to be harder. A ghost of a smile crossed her face. I expect so. That night, after tending to the horses and checking on the cattle near the barn, Ethan climbed to the house and found Lydia in the kitchen, her hands wrapped in clean bandages, preparing dinner over the stove. You don't have to cook, he said. We have to eat, she replied, and I'm perfectly capable of preparing a meal. The food, a simple stew with vegetables and salt pork, was better than anything Ethan had made in months. They ate in comfortable silence, the day's work settling between them like a shared understanding. Ethan, Lydia said as she cleared the plates, why did you really agree to my proposal? He considered lying, offering some noble reason, but she'd been honest with him, so he returned the favor. Because I didn't think you'd last 3 days, he admitted, and I wanted to prove you wrong about being able to handle ranch life. Lydia laughed, a genuine, unexpected sound. That's fair. I suppose we both have something to prove then. What's that? You're trying to prove I'll fail, she said, and I'm trying to prove you wrong. Ethan almost smiled. Seems like a poor basis for partnership. Or, Lydia countered, it's the most honest one possible. She had a point. What? The days that followed fell into a brutal rhythm. Dawn came early and cold, and Lydia met it every morning, dressed and ready before Ethan finished his coffee. They worked cattle, rounding up strays, checking for disease, moving herds between pastures. They repaired equipment, hauled supplies, mucked stalls, and split firewood for the approaching winter. Lydia struggled. There was no hiding it. Tasks that took Ethan or Coop minutes took her half an hour. She couldn't rope cattle worth a damn. Her riding was adequate but clumsy, and she lacked the raw strength for some of the heavier work. But she never quit. When she couldn't lift a full feed sack, she carried 2 half sacks. When she couldn't rope a running calf, she worked the gate instead, learning the timing until she could swing it shut at exactly the right moment. When her muscles screamed from exhaustion, she kept moving until the day's work was done. Coop's skepticism gradually shifted to something like respect. "She's tougher than she looks," he admitted to Ethan one evening as they watched Lydia stack firewood with methodical determination. "Most folks would have quit by now." "Most folks have sense," Ethan replied, though he couldn't keep the grudging admiration from his voice. On the 8th day, Lydia surprised him. They were checking the herd in the east pasture when she suddenly pulled her horse to a stop, standing in the stirrups and shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. "What is it?" Ethan asked. "That cow," Lydia pointed to a heifer standing apart from the main herd. "She's moving wrong." Ethan looked. The heifer appeared fine at first glance, but Lydia was right. There was a hitch in the animal's gait, a slight favoring of her left rear leg. They rode closer, and Ethan dismounted to examine the leg. A deep cut, probably from barbed wire, had begun to swell with infection. "How did you spot that from 50 yards away?" he asked, cleaning the wound. "I didn't at first," Lydia admitted, "but I've been watching how the healthy cattle move. She was different. I figured it was worth checking." Ethan glanced up at her. She was sitting her horse with more confidence now, her posture straight, her hands steady on the reins. The blisters had healed into calluses, her face had tanned from constant sun exposure, and something in her eyes had sharpened, a confidence that came from doing hard things and surviving them. "Good eye," he said simply. That night, as they settled into their usual post-dinner routine, Lydia calculating feed costs while Ethan repaired tack, a knock sounded at the door. Ethan opened it to find a man he recognized but didn't welcome. Carl Brennan, one of Victor Rourke's hired hands. "Cade," Brennan said, his tone falsely friendly. "Mr. Rourke sent me to deliver a message." "I'm not interested in messages from Rourke," Ethan replied. "Well, you might want to hear this one." Brennan's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Rourke's had surveyors out checking property lines. Turns out some of that north pasture you've been using, it's not actually yours." Ethan's jaw tightened. "That land's been open range for 20 years. "Open range ain't the same as owned, Cade. Mr. Rourke's got papers showing it belongs to the territorial land company he represents. He's willing to let you lease it, of course. Fair price, only 30% of your annual cattle sales." 30% is theft, not fair." Brennan shrugged. "That's between you and Mr. Rourke. But he wanted me to mention that if you're not willing to negotiate, he's got other ways of resolving land disputes, ways that might get uncomfortable." Before Ethan could respond, Lydia appeared at his shoulder. "Is that a threat, Mr. Brennan?" Brennan's eyes widened slightly. Apparently he hadn't noticed her. "Ma'am, this is business between ranchers. No need for it." "I asked if that was a threat," Lydia interrupted, her voice cold and precise. "Because if Mr. Rourke is threatening property disputes through intimidation rather than legal channels, that's a matter for the territorial courts, not private negotiation." Brennan's smile faded. "You some kind of lawyer, lady?" "No, but I can read, and I know that attempting to seize claimed land through fraudulent surveys is a federal crime under the Homestead Act of 1862, as amended in 1872. Lydia crossed her arms. "I suggest you tell Mr. Rourke that before he commits any more actionable offenses, he should verify his survey claims with the Territorial Land Office, in writing, with proper documentation." Brennan stared at her, clearly not expecting legal citations from a woman on a Montana ranch. I'll pass that along." "You do that," Lydia said pleasantly. "And Mr. Brennan? If you or anyone else from Mr. Rourke's operation sets foot on this property again without invitation, we'll consider it trespassing and respond accordingly." After Brennan left, Ethan closed the door and turned to Lydia. "Where did you learn about land law?" "My uncle's dry goods business involved property disputes more often than you'd think," she said. "Landlords claiming ownership of leased space, developers trying to seize property through legal technicalities. I learned to read contracts and statutes because it was the only way to fight back." Ethan felt something shift in his chest, a realization that this woman was more than just stubborn. She was strategic. "Rourke's not going to back down because you quoted law at his hired hand," he said quietly. "I know," Lydia replied, But now he knows we're not easy targets, and sometimes that's enough to make bullies think twice. Ethan wanted to believe that, but he'd seen men like Victor Rourke before, powerful, ruthless, and used to getting what they wanted. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The trouble came faster than Ethan expected. 3 days after Brennan's visit, Ethan and Coop found a section of fence cut in the south pasture. 20 head of cattle had drifted onto what Rourke claimed was his land. Could be accident, Coop said, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it. Could be, Ethan agreed, or it could be Rourke making a point. They rounded up the cattle and repaired the fence, but the message was clear. Rourke was escalating. That evening, Lydia proposed something Ethan hadn't considered. "We need to talk to the other ranchers," she said over dinner. "About what?" "About Rourke. If he's using fraudulent surveys to claim land from you, he's probably doing it to others. Isolated ranchers are easy targets, but if we organize, ranchers don't organize," Ethan interrupted. "We're too stubborn and too independent." "Then maybe it's time to change that," Lydia countered. "Rourke's counting on everyone fighting their own battles. He can pick you off one by one, but if you stand together—" "You've been here less than 2 weeks," Ethan said, frustration bleeding into his voice. "You don't understand how things work out here." Lydia's eyes flashed. "I understand that doing the same thing and expecting different results is foolishness. You said yourself that ranchers operate on thin margins. One bad season, one land seizure, and everything falls apart. So either you adapt or you lose." "And what do you know about losing?" The words came out harsher than Ethan intended. Lydia stood, her chair scraping against the floor. "I know that I lost my parents to cholera when I was 16. I know that I lost my uncle, the only family I had left who treated me like a person instead of a marriageable asset, to a heart attack 3 years ago. I know what it's like to watch everything you've built disappear because someone with more power decided to take it." Her voice was steady, but there was steel beneath it, the kind forged by genuine pain, not borrowed sympathy. "I didn't come here to play house or escape boredom, Ethan. I came here because I was tired of being powerless. So if you think I'm going to stand by and watch the same thing happen to you, to us, without fighting back, you're wrong." Ethan stared at her, seeing clearly for the first time what he'd missed before. This wasn't a woman playing at frontier life. This was someone who'd already survived her own battles and had no intention of losing another. "All right," he said quietly. "What do you propose?" Lydia sat back down, her expression shifting from anger to focus. "We start by talking to your neighbors. Find out if anyone else has had disputes with Rourke or his land company. Document everything: fence cuts, survey claims, intimidation. Then we take it to someone with authority." "The territorial judge only comes through twice a year," Ethan said, "and Rourke has connections." "Then we make sure our case is airtight before he arrives," Lydia replied. "And we make enough noise that ignoring it becomes politically inconvenient." It was ambitious, probably impossible, but looking at Lydia's determined face, Ethan found himself believing it might actually work. "The nearest ranch is the Dawson place," he said, "about 5 miles west. Tom Dawson's been ranching here longer than anyone." "Then we start there," Lydia said. "Tomorrow." Tom Dawson was a weathered man in his 60s who'd been running cattle in Montana since before Ethan was born. He listened to their story with a skeptical expression, his wife Martha standing beside him with arms crossed. "Rourke's made noise about boundary disputes before," Tom admitted, "but nobody's challenged him directly. He's got money, lawyers, and connections in Helena." "He's also got forged documents," Lydia said. "If we can prove it—" "Proving it and surviving it are different things, young lady," Martha interrupted. "We've seen what happens to folks who cross powerful men. They lose more than land." "So you do nothing?" Lydia challenged. "Let him take whatever he wants?" "We survive," Tom said simply. "That's what matters out here." But as they were leaving, Martha pulled Lydia aside. "We lost 40 acres to a boundary correction 2 years ago," she said quietly. "Tom won't admit it, but it nearly broke us. If you're serious about fighting back, we'd be willing to help." Quietly. It was a start. Over the next week, Lydia and Ethan visited every ranch within 20 miles. The story was the same everywhere. Rourke's land company making claims, pressuring ranchers, using legal technicalities and intimidation to expand their holdings. Most ranchers were afraid to fight back, but several, like the Dawsons, were willing to share information if it meant stopping Rourke. Lydia documented everything in a ledger she'd brought from Boston, creating a record of claims, dates, and incidents. Her neat handwriting filled page after page with evidence. "You're good at this," Ethan said one evening, watching her work. "I managed accounts for my uncle for years," Lydia replied without looking up. "This is just a different kind of ledger." "It's more than that." Ethan hesitated. "You're giving people hope. That's not something you can put in a ledger." Lydia finally looked up, meeting his eyes. "Hope doesn't mean anything if we can't back it up with action." "I know, but it's a start." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that went beyond their 30-day agreement. They were in this together now, whether either of them had planned it or not. The realization should have terrified Ethan. Instead, it felt like the first solid ground he'd stood on in years. But before he could find words for that feeling, Coop burst through the door, his face pale. "Boss, we got trouble, big trouble." They followed him outside, and Ethan's blood turned to ice. On the western horizon, orange flames lit the night sky. The barn was burning. Ethan ran. His boots pounded across the hard-packed earth, Lydia and Coop flanking him on either side, all three racing toward the inferno that had once been his barn. The structure groaned and cracked as flames consumed the dry timber, sending sparks spiraling into the black Montana sky like malevolent stars. Heat hit them in waves even from 50 yards away, forcing Ethan to shield his face with his arm. "The horses!" Lydia's voice cut through the roar of the fire. Ethan's heart lurched. He'd stabled 3 horses in the barn tonight, his roan gelding, Coop's mare, and the draft horse they used for heavy hauling. He changed direction mid-stride, heading for the barn doors, but Coop grabbed his shoulder. "Boss, the roof's going! You can't!" "Like hell I can't!" Ethan shook him off and kept running. The barn doors stood partially open, smoke billowing out in thick black clouds that stung his eyes and seared his lungs. Through the haze, he could hear the horses screaming, high, terrified sounds that cut straight through him. He pulled his bandana over his nose and mouth and plunged inside. The world became fire and smoke. Flames crawled up the support beams, eating through wood that had taken him 2 years to cure and cut. The heat was unbearable, like standing too close to a forge, and the smoke made it nearly impossible to see. Ethan moved by memory, feeling his way along the stalls. His roan was in the first stall, eyes rolling white with terror, hooves striking the door. Ethan yanked the latch open, and the horse bolted past him, heading for open air. 1 down. The second stall held Coop's mare, but the latch had warped from the heat. Ethan kicked it twice before it gave way, and the mare followed the gelding into the night. The third stall was at the far end of the barn, where the fire burned hottest. The draft horse, a big bay named Duke, was trapped behind a door that wouldn't budge. The latch had melted into the frame. "Come on, you bastard!" Ethan growled, slamming his shoulder against the door. Pain shot through his arm, but the door didn't move. Above him, a beam cracked with a sound like a gunshot. Ethan looked up and saw the barn's center support beginning to sag, flames eating through its core. He had seconds, maybe less. He kicked the door with everything he had, once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th kick, wood splintered and the door swung open. Duke charged out, nearly trampling him, and Ethan stumbled backward, choking on smoke. That's when the beam gave way. Ethan dove sideways, hitting the ground hard as burning timber crashed down where he'd been standing. Sparks showered across his back, and he felt his shirt catch fire. He rolled, smothering the flames, then scrambled to his feet and ran for the door. He burst out of the barn into cool night air, gasping and coughing, his lungs burning. Strong hands grabbed him, Lydia on one side, Coop on the other, and dragged him away from the collapsing structure. "Are you insane?" Lydia's voice was fierce, but her hands were gentle as she checked him for injuries. "You could have been killed!" "Horses," Ethan managed between coughs, "are safe. All 3 of them." She pointed to where the animals stood in the corral, still spooked but unharmed. "Which is more than I can say for you." Ethan looked down at himself. His shirt was scorched, his hands were burned, and he could taste blood where he'd bitten his tongue during the fall. But he was alive, and so were the horses. Behind them, the barn collapsed with a roar that sounded like the end of the world. The entire structure folded inward, sending a pillar of flame and sparks shooting into the sky. Ethan watched 2 years of work disappear in seconds. "The winter stores," he said numbly. "All the hay, the feed, the tack." "I know," Lydia said quietly, still gripping his arm. They stood there in silence, watching everything burn. Coop retrieved buckets and they formed a line to the water trough, throwing water on the surrounding buildings to keep the fire from spreading. It was futile work, the barn was already lost, but it gave them something to do besides watch their livelihood turn to ash. It took 3 hours for the fire to burn itself out. When the last flames finally died, all that remained was a skeletal framework of charred beams standing like broken ribs against the dawn sky. Ethan walked through the ruins as the sun rose, cataloging the losses. Every piece of equipment stored in the barn, destroyed. All the hay he'd cut last summer, gone. The winter feed he'd stockpiled for the cattle, ash. The saddles, bridles, and tack that had taken years to acquire melted or burned beyond recognition. In dollar terms, he'd lost at least $3,000. In practical terms, he'd lost his ability to keep the ranch running through winter. Lydia appeared beside him, her face streaked with soot, her dress ruined from the night's work. She didn't say anything, just stood there surveying the destruction with the same calculating expression she'd worn when examining his account books. "This wasn't an accident," Ethan said. "I know. Rourke did this." "Can you prove it?" Lydia asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Ethan shook his head. He'd found no evidence of arson, no signs of who'd set the fire, just destruction and loss. "Then we document it," Lydia said. "Add it to the ledger. Another incident, another pattern." "A pattern won't rebuild my barn or replace my winter stores," Ethan said bitterly. "No, but it will help us stop him from doing this to anyone else." Ethan turned to face her. She stood there covered in soot and ash, exhausted from fighting a losing battle all night, and still talking about justice and patterns like they were armor against reality. "You should leave," he said. Lydia's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me? This isn't your fight. You've got," he calculated quickly, 21 days left on our agreement. "But the ranch is finished. I can't rebuild this before winter. Can't feed the cattle without stored hay. Can't work them properly without tack. You came here looking for a fresh start, not a lost cause." "I came here looking for a partnership," Lydia corrected, "and partners don't abandon each other when things get difficult." "This is beyond difficult. This is exactly what Rourke wants," she interrupted. "He wants you broken, defeated, ready to sell cheap or walk away. So if you're suggesting I leave because you think the fight's over, you're wrong. And if you're suggesting I leave because you're trying to protect me, then you don't know me as well as I thought." Ethan felt something crack open in his chest, some wall he'd built after too many losses, too many betrayals. "I can't ask you to stay for this." "You're not asking, I'm choosing." Lydia stepped closer, her voice dropping but losing none of its steel. "I've watched men with power destroy people weaker than themselves my entire life. I stood by while my family forced me into a life I didn't want because I didn't have the strength or knowledge to fight back. But I'm not that person anymore, Ethan. I didn't travel 2,000 miles to run at the first sign of trouble. This isn't trouble. This is war. Then it's a good thing I'm not fighting alone." She held his gaze, unflinching. "The question is, are you giving up? Because if you are, tell me now, and I'll leave. But if you're willing to fight, really fight, then stop trying to push me away and let me help." Ethan stared at this impossible woman who'd arrived less than 3 weeks ago and somehow become the strongest thing holding him together. "All right," he said finally. "We fight." Lydia nodded once, satisfied. "Good. Then we need a plan." They spent the rest of the morning taking stock of what remained. The horses were safe, the cattle were unharmed, the bunkhouse, smokehouse, and main house had survived. But without the barn, without winter feed, without equipment, the ranch couldn't function. Coop approached them around midday, his expression grim. "Boss, I hate to say it, but without a barn or winter stores, I can't stay on. Got a cousin in Helena who might have work. I need to—" "I understand," Ethan said, though the words tasted like defeat. You've been a good hand, Coop. I'll pay you what I owe for the month. Keep it, Coop said. You're going to need every dollar. He hesitated. For what it's worth, I think you've got a chance. With her. He nodded toward Lydia. She's tougher than most men I've known. After Coop left to gather his things, Lydia and Ethan sat on the porch steps, watching the ruins smolder in the afternoon heat. We need money, Lydia said. Enough to replace the winter feed at minimum, and ideally enough to start rebuilding. I've got about $400 saved, Ethan said. It's not enough. What about selling cattle early? Market prices are low right now. I'd take a loss on every head, and even then, I'd barely break even. Lydia was quiet for a moment, thinking. What if we didn't sell to the usual markets? What if we found buyers willing to pay premium prices? Like who? The mining camps. I saw advertisements in Helena, mines paying top dollar for fresh beef because transport costs are so high. If we could drive a herd directly to them. That's a 3-week journey through mountain passes, Ethan interrupted. Dangerous even with a full crew and proper equipment. We've got neither. We have cattle, horses, and determination, Lydia countered. And we have time, just barely. If we move fast, we could drive a herd to the camps, sell at premium prices, and get back before the first heavy snow. Ethan wanted to say it was impossible. The mountain routes were treacherous, the weather unpredictable, and attempting a cattle drive with just 2 people was borderline suicidal. But looking at their options, sell the ranch at a loss, abandon everything he'd built, or take a desperate gamble, the choice became clear. We'd need to move 100 head to make it worthwhile, he said slowly, thinking through the logistics. That's manageable with 2 experienced riders, but it'll be brutal. I'm not experienced, but I'm learning fast, Lydia said, and I can shoot. Ethan looked at her sharply. You know how to handle a rifle? My uncle taught me when I was 17. He didn't believe women should be helpless. She met his eyes. I'm not a sharpshooter, but I can hit what I aim at. Another surprise from the woman who kept defying his expectations. Even if we make it to the mining camps and sell the cattle, it's still only a stopgap, Ethan said. Rourke will still be here when we get back. The barn will still be ashes. But we'll have money, leverage, and proof that we're not giving up, Lydia replied. And while we're gone, word will spread. People will see that Rourke couldn't break us with one fire. That matters, Ethan. It changes the story from the Cade Ranch failed to the Cade Ranch fought back. She was right. Symbols mattered on the frontier, where reputation and perceived strength could mean the difference between being targeted and being left alone. All right, Ethan said. We drive the herd to the mining camps, but we do this smart. Take the strongest cattle, travel light, and move fast. No unnecessary risks. Lydia smiled. Agreed. When do we leave? Tomorrow at dawn. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Ethan selected the 100 healthiest cattle from his herd while Lydia packed supplies, food, ammunition, basic medical supplies, and the repaired tack they'd salvaged from the fire's edge. Every item had to serve multiple purposes. Every pound counted. That evening, as they made final preparations, a rider approached the ranch. Ethan recognized Tom Dawson immediately and felt his stomach tighten. News traveled fast in the valley, and he had no doubt word of the fire had already spread. Heard about your barn, Tom said without preamble. Came to see if the rumors were true. They are. Ethan gestured toward the blackened ruins. Tom dismounted and walked through the ashes, his weathered face impossible to read. When he returned, he fixed Ethan with a hard stare. You think Rourke did this? I know he did, just can't prove it. Then you're planning to roll over and sell? No, Lydia said, stepping out of the house. We're planning to fight. Tom studied her for a long moment. Martha was right about you. You've got spine. He turned back to Ethan. What's your plan? Ethan laid it out, the cattle drive, the mining camps, the desperate gamble to raise enough money to survive winter and rebuild. When he finished, Tom was quiet for so long that Ethan thought he'd decided they were fools. Then the older rancher surprised him. I've got 2 horses you can borrow for the drive, Tom said. Steady animals, good in the mountains, and Martha put together some extra provisions, dried meat, beans, coffee. It's not much, but it might help. Ethan felt something lodge in his throat. Tom, I can't. Yes, you can, Tom interrupted. Because if you succeed, it proves Rourke can be beaten. And if you fail, at least you went down fighting instead of rolling over. He extended his hand. This valley needs more people willing to stand up. Don't make me regret thinking you're one of them. They shook hands, and Ethan felt the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders. This wasn't just about his ranch anymore. It was about everyone Rourke had threatened, everyone who'd been too scared or too beaten down to fight back. After Tom left, Lydia found Ethan standing at the corral, staring at the cattle they'd be driving tomorrow. You're having second thoughts, she observed. I'm having third and fourth thoughts, Ethan admitted. If we fail, I'll have nothing left. The ranch, the cattle, everything, gone. And if we don't try? Same result, just slower. Lydia leaned against the fence beside him. Then we might as well fail spectacularly rather than surrender quietly. Despite everything, Ethan almost laughed. Is that how they teach optimism in Boston? No, that's how they teach survival, Lydia said. You fight until you can't anymore, and then you fight a little more. It's not noble or pretty, but it works. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the mountains they'd be crossing. Somewhere in those peaks, danger waited. Weather, predators, treacherous paths, but also opportunity if they were strong enough to seize it. Lydia, Ethan said quietly, if something happens to me out there, nothing's going to happen. But if it does, he pressed, the ranch papers are in the top drawer of my desk. Everything's paid off except a small loan at the bank in Silver Ridge. You sell the land, you'll have enough to start over somewhere safer. Lydia turned to face him, her expression fierce. I didn't agree to this partnership so I could inherit your failure, Ethan. We're both coming back, and we're both rebuilding this ranch, together. Understand? The certainty in her voice made him want to believe it. Understood, he said. They set out before dawn, driving the cattle north toward the mountain passes. The 100 head moved as a loose group, guided by Ethan and Lydia riding on opposite flanks. The borrowed horses from Tom Dawson proved their worth immediately. Steady, calm animals that didn't spook at the cattle's unpredictable movements. The first day passed without incident. They covered 12 miles, pushing the herd at a steady pace that wouldn't exhaust the animals, but kept them moving. When they made camp that night, Lydia proved she'd learned more about frontier life than Ethan had given her credit for. She built a fire efficiently, cooked a simple but filling meal, and set up their bedrolls without needing instruction. You've been practicing, Ethan observed as she handed him a plate of beans and salt pork. I read a book about frontier survival before leaving Boston, Lydia admitted. I figured if I was going to live in Montana, I should know how to not die in Montana. That's probably the smartest thing any mail-order bride has ever done. Lydia smiled. I'm glad you think so, because I also read chapters on treating snake bites, splinting broken bones, and delivering calves. I'm hoping we don't need any of those skills, but better to have them and not need them, Ethan finished. The second day brought their first real test. They were climbing into the foothills when one of the younger steers broke from the herd and bolted toward a ravine. Ethan wheeled his horse and gave chase, but Lydia was faster. She spurred her borrowed mount forward, cutting the steer off before it could reach the dangerous ground, and turned it back toward the herd with movements that were far more confident than they'd been 3 weeks ago. Nice work, Ethan called out. Lydia grinned, flushed with success. I'm starting to understand why you do this. There's something satisfying about outsmarting a cow. Wait until one outsmarts you, Ethan replied. Then we'll talk. That night, camped beside a narrow creek, they sat by the fire while the cattle grazed nearby. The temperature had dropped as they'd gained elevation, and Lydia sat closer to the flames than usual, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. Tell me about the war, she said suddenly. Ethan stiffened. Why? Because you carry it with you, Lydia said. I've seen how you react to loud noises, how you sometimes look at the horizon like you're expecting an attack. And I think it might help me understand you better if I knew what you've survived. For a long moment, Ethan considered refusing. The war wasn't something he talked about, not with Coop, not with anyone. But Lydia had been honest with him about her losses, her reasons for coming west. Maybe he owed her the same honesty. I enlisted when I was 19, he said finally, staring into the fire. Thought it would be quick. Everyone did. Instead, it was 4 years of hell. Shiloh, Vicksburg, Atlanta, every battle worse than the last. He paused, the memories clawing at him. I watched friends die in ways that still wake me up at night. Saw men reduced to animals by fear and pain. And somewhere in the middle of it all, I stopped being the person I was before and became someone else. Someone harder. But you survived, Lydia said softly. Physically. Ethan touched the scar on his jaw. Got this at Shiloh when a shell fragment caught me. Spent 2 weeks in a field hospital that was more butcher shop than medical facility. When I finally got out, I realized I didn't recognize myself anymore. Is that why you came to Montana? Partly. I needed distance from everything that reminded me of those years. Needed to build something instead of destroying it. He looked at her. The ranch was supposed to be my way forward. A place where the only battles were against weather and wolves, not men. And then Rourke appeared, Lydia said. And then Rourke appeared, Ethan agreed bitterly. Turns out you can't escape conflict. It just finds new forms. Lydia was quiet for a moment, processing. Then she said something that surprised him. I'm glad you survived the war, not just because you're here now, but because the world needs people who've seen darkness and still choose to build instead of destroy. Ethan met her eyes across the fire. What makes you think I'm building? Maybe I'm just too stubborn to quit. Stubbornness is a form of hope, Lydia replied. And hope is how you build a future. The third day brought rain, cold, relentless sheets that turned the mountain trail into slick mud and made every step treacherous. The cattle slowed to a crawl, and both Ethan and Lydia were soaked within an hour. But they kept moving, knowing that stopping would mean losing time they couldn't afford. By evening, they were all miserable. Ethan managed to get a fire started under a rocky overhang that provided minimal shelter, but everything was damp, and the flames struggled to catch. We should have waited for better weather, he said, frustration evident in his voice. We didn't have the luxury of waiting, Lydia replied. She was shivering, her lips tinged blue despite being wrapped in a wet blanket. We make do with what we have. Ethan looked at her, this stubborn, impossible woman who'd insisted on joining a dangerous cattle drive despite having no real experience, who'd been soaked and cold for hours and hadn't complained once. You're going to catch pneumonia, he said. So are you. Lydia moved closer to the weak fire. Which is why we're both going to sit here and dry out before we do anything else. They sat in silence, listening to the rain hammer the rocks above them and the cattle shifting restlessly nearby. Eventually, exhausted, Lydia's head drooped against Ethan's shoulder. He should have moved away, maintained the professional distance they'd carefully preserved. Instead, he stayed still, letting her rest, acutely aware of her warmth against his side. Somewhere during the night, listening to the rain and feeling Lydia's steady breathing, Ethan admitted something to himself that he'd been avoiding for weeks. He didn't want this to be temporary. He didn't want her to leave at the end of 30 days. He wanted her to stay. Not because of their agreement, not because she'd proven herself capable, but because she'd become essential to him in ways that had nothing to do with ranch work. The realization terrified him. The fourth day dawned clear, and they made good progress, pushing the herd higher into the mountains. By the fifth day, they'd reached the most dangerous part of the journey, a narrow pass that snaked between sheer cliffs, barely wide enough for the cattle to move single file. We take this slow, Ethan instructed. One wrong step and we'll lose animals over the edge. They spent 6 hours navigating the pass, every minute tense with the possibility of disaster. But Lydia's steady presence on the opposite side of the herd, her calm voice guiding nervous cattle, made the impossible task manageable. When they finally emerged on the far side, both of them were exhausted but triumphant. They'd crossed the worst terrain without losing a single animal. We might actually make it, Lydia said, wonder in her voice. Don't jinx it, Ethan replied, but he was smiling. The mining camp appeared on the 7th day, a sprawling collection of tents and rough structures clinging to the mountainside like barnacles. Smoke rose from dozens of cook fires, and the sound of picks striking stone echoed through the valley. Ethan rode into camp alone first, leaving Lydia with the herd, and found the camp's supply manager, a shrewd man named Morrison, who looked at the world through narrowed, calculating eyes. Fresh beef? Morrison's eyebrows rose. Haven't had that in 3 months. What are you asking? Ethan named a price 50% higher than standard market rates. Morrison laughed. That's robbery. That's what it costs to drive cattle through mountain passes in uncertain weather, Ethan countered. You want salt pork and dried rations? I'm sure you can get them cheaper. You want fresh beef to keep your miners happy and productive? This is the price. They haggled for 20 minutes before settling on a figure that made Ethan's heart race. It was more money than he'd made in the last 2 years combined, enough to replace the winter feed, buy lumber for rebuilding, and still have a cushion for emergencies. When he rode back to Lydia with the news, she actually laughed out loud. "We did it," she said, disbelief and joy mixing in her voice. "We actually did it." "We did," Ethan agreed. "You did. This was your idea." "Our idea," Lydia corrected. "Partners, remember?" The cattle were delivered that afternoon, and Morrison paid in cash, crisp bills that Ethan counted twice to make sure they were real. As the sun set over the mining camp, he and Lydia sat at the edge of camp, watching the miners celebrate their fresh beef supply. "What now?" Lydia asked. "Now we go home," Ethan said, "and we rebuild." "And Rourke?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Rourke's going to learn that burning my barn was the worst mistake he ever made." The ride back to Silver Ridge felt different than the journey out. They traveled lighter, faster, with money secured in Ethan's saddlebag, and a newfound confidence between them that hadn't existed before. The mountain passes that had seemed so threatening a week ago now felt conquerable, just another obstacle they'd overcome together. But the closer they got to home, the more Ethan felt the weight of what awaited them. Rourke wouldn't have stopped while they were gone. Men like him never did. They saw weakness and attacked until there was nothing left to take. They reached the ranch on a cool afternoon, 11 days after they'd left. The blackened ruins of the barn stood as a stark reminder of what they'd lost. But now, with money in hand and determination in their hearts, it looked less like an ending and more like a starting point. Ethan had barely dismounted when he noticed fresh horse tracks leading from the main road to his property and back again. Multiple riders, recent enough that the edges of the hoofprints were still sharp. "We had visitors," Lydia observed, studying the same tracks. "Rourke's men," Ethan said grimly. "Probably came to see if we'd abandoned the place." They found the evidence inside the house. Nothing had been stolen, but drawers had been opened, papers rifled through, and Ethan's desk had been searched thoroughly. Someone had been looking for something specific. "The ranch papers," Lydia said, examining the disturbed documents. "They wanted to know if you'd defaulted on any loans, if the property was vulnerable to seizure." "They didn't find anything useful," Ethan replied, checking the hidden compartment where he kept the actual deed. "Everything important is still here." "Which means they'll try something else," Lydia's expression hardened. "We need to move faster than they expect." Over the next 2 days, they worked with focused intensity. Ethan rode to Silver Ridge and ordered lumber, nails, and supplies from the general store, paying in cash, which raised eyebrows among the merchants who'd heard about his barn burning. He also stopped at the telegraph office and sent messages to 3 ranchers they'd visited before the fire, asking them to meet at his ranch in 3 days' time. Lydia, meanwhile, spent hours in the ranch house with her ledger, documenting everything they'd learned about Rourke's operation. She wrote letters to the Territorial Land Office in Helena, requesting official surveys of disputed properties. She composed a formal complaint to the Territorial Marshal, outlining the pattern of intimidation and property destruction. Every word was precise, every claim backed by documented evidence. "You write like a lawyer," Ethan observed, reading over her shoulder. "My uncle had me draft contracts for his business," Lydia explained. "He said if I was going to challenge men in court, I needed to speak their language better than they did." "Did it work?" "Often enough?" She signed another letter with a flourish. "The key is making yourself too expensive to fight. If Rourke thinks taking us down will cost more than it's worth, he'll look for easier targets." "And if he doesn't?" Lydia met his eyes. "Then we make him regret it." The meeting Ethan had called took place on a warm afternoon with 6 ranchers gathered in what remained of his barn's foundation. Tom Dawson was there, along with Martha. Frank Cooper, who ran cattle 20 miles south, arrived with his 2 grown sons. The Harrison brothers, younger men who'd started ranching 3 years ago, came together, their faces set with determination. Lydia stood beside Ethan as he addressed the group, her presence a silent statement that she belonged in this discussion. You all know why you're here, Ethan began. Rourke's been pushing boundaries for years, claiming land that isn't his, intimidating anyone who challenges him. 2 weeks ago, he burned my barn. Could just as easily have been any of yours. But it wasn't, Frank Cooper said bluntly. Why should we risk our ranches fighting your battle? Because it's not just my battle, Lydia interjected before Ethan could respond. We've documented 14 separate incidents over the past 2 years where Rourke's land company made fraudulent boundary claims. 4 of you are on that list. She pulled out her ledger and read names and dates. Tom Dawson, 40 acres claimed through a falsified survey in 1873. Frank Cooper, water rights disputed last spring using forged territorial documents. Harrison Brothers, fence lines moved 3 times in 2 years, always in Rourke's favor. The ranchers shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the truth in her words. We let him take a little at a time because fighting seemed too costly, Lydia continued. But small losses add up. In 2 years, Rourke's company has claimed over 600 acres of land that belong to small ranchers. How much more are we willing to lose before we say enough? Fighting back could cost us everything, one of the Harrison brothers said. So we're doing nothing, Ethan replied. Just slower. Tom Dawson cleared his throat. What exactly are you proposing? Lydia stepped forward. We file a formal complaint with the territorial judge when he arrives next month. But we don't do it individually. We do it as a unified group. We present evidence of fraud, intimidation, and property destruction. We show a pattern of illegal activity that demands investigation. Rourke's got lawyers, Frank said. Good ones. We've got truth and documentation, Lydia countered. And if we stand together, we're too big to ignore or intimidate. She's right, Martha Dawson spoke up, surprising several of the men. We've been letting Rourke pick us off one at a time because we were afraid. But there's strength in numbers. If we all testify to what he's done, the judge will have to act. The discussion went on for another hour, with arguments and counter-arguments flying back and forth. Some ranchers were eager to fight, others hesitant, all of them aware that challenging Rourke meant risking everything they'd built. Finally, Frank Cooper stood. I'm in. Not because I trust lawyers or judges, but because I'm tired of watching my land disappear piece by piece. One by one, the others agreed. By the time the meeting ended, they had 7 ranches committed to standing together against Rourke's land company. As the ranchers departed, Tom Dawson pulled Ethan aside. That woman of yours is something special. Where'd you find her? Boston, Ethan said. Through a letter. Tom laughed. Best letter you ever wrote, I'd wager. After everyone left, Lydia and Ethan stood in the ruins of his barn, watching the sun set over the mountains. They're scared, Lydia observed, but they're willing to fight. Because you gave them hope, Ethan said. You made them believe we could win. Can we? Lydia asked quietly. Win, I mean, really? Ethan considered the question honestly. They had evidence, unity, and determination, but Rourke had money, connections, and years of experience crushing people who challenged him. I don't know, he admitted, but I know we have a better chance together than we ever did alone. Lydia nodded, accepting the honesty. Then she said something that had clearly been weighing on her mind. Our 30 days are almost up. Ethan felt his chest tighten. He'd been so focused on fighting Rourke, on rebuilding, that he'd lost track of time. But Lydia was right. Tomorrow marked exactly 30 days since she'd stepped off that stagecoach. So they are, he said carefully. I proved I could work the ranch, Lydia continued, her voice steady, but her eyes uncertain. I met the terms of our agreement. You did more than that. You saved it. We saved it, she corrected. Together. She turned to face him fully. Which brings us to the question we've been avoiding. What happens now? Ethan knew what he wanted to say. He wanted to ask her to stay permanently, to become his partner, not just in business, but in life. He wanted to tell her that somewhere between fence repairs and cattle drives, she'd become essential to him in ways he hadn't thought possible. But the words stuck in his throat, blocked by years of caution and the fear that he was asking too much. What do you want to happen? He asked instead. Lydia's expression flickered with something that might have been disappointment. I want honesty, Ethan. No more dancing around what we both know. All right, Ethan took a breath. I want you to stay. Not because you're useful, not because the ranch needs you, but because I need you. You make me believe in things I thought I'd lost the capacity for. Trust, partnership, maybe even something more. But I won't trap you here out of obligation or gratitude. So if you want to leave, if you've had enough of Montana and burnt barns and cattle drives, I'll understand. Lydia was quiet for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Then she smiled, a real smile that lit up her features in a way he'd rarely seen. I left Boston to escape a life where everyone else made my choices, she said. I came here to build something that was mine. And in these 30 days, I found exactly that. Not just a ranch or a partnership, but a place where I belong. So yes, Ethan Cade, I'll stay. Not because you asked, but because I choose to. The relief that flooded through Ethan was almost overwhelming. He reached for her hand and she took it without hesitation. Partners? He asked. Partners? Lydia confirmed. In everything. They stood there in the fading light, hands clasped, both of them aware that they'd just made a commitment that went far deeper than any business arrangement. But before either could say more, the sound of approaching horses shattered the moment. 3 riders emerged from the evening shadows, and Ethan recognized the lead rider immediately, Victor Rourke himself, flanked by 2 of his men. Rourke was a tall man in his 50s, impeccably dressed even for a ranch visit, with cold eyes that assessed everything like a banker evaluating collateral. Cade, Rourke said, reining his horse to a stop. I heard you were back. Successful trip to the mining camps, I understand. Ethan felt Lydia tense beside him. What do you want, Rourke? Just being neighborly, Rourke said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Wanted to see how you're faring after your unfortunate fire. Terrible thing, that. Barn fires can ruin a man. I'm rebuilding, Ethan said flatly. So I see. With mining camp money, no less. Enterprising. Rourke's gaze shifted to Lydia. And you must be the mail-order bride I've heard about. Though from what I understand, you're much more than that now. Lydia Hale, she said, her voice cool and professional. And you're Victor Rourke, the man who's been making fraudulent land claims across the valley. Rourke's smile faded. Careful with accusations, Miss Hale. Slander is a serious offense. It's only slander if it's false, Lydia replied. We have documented evidence of 14 separate fraudulent boundary claims, multiple incidents of intimidation, and 1 case of arson. Would you like to dispute any of those facts? I'd like to offer Mr. Cade a business opportunity, Rourke said, ignoring her question. He turned back to Ethan. I'm prepared to purchase your ranch for a fair price. More than fair, actually, considering its current condition. Enough money to start fresh somewhere less challenging. Not interested, Ethan said. You should hear my offer before refusing. I don't care what your offer is. This ranch isn't for sale. Rourke's expression hardened. You're making a mistake, Cade. I've been patient, but my patience has limits. The territorial land company I represent has legal claims to portions of your property. We can resolve this amicably, or we can let the courts decide. I promise you, the courts will be expensive and time-consuming. Then let's go to court, Lydia said. We'll present our evidence of fraud to the territorial judge next month. I'm sure he'll be very interested in examining your company's survey practices. For the first time, Rourke looked genuinely surprised. You think a judge will side with a struggling rancher over a legitimate land company? I think a judge will side with whoever has better documentation, Lydia replied. And we have letters, ledgers, witness statements, and physical evidence of boundary manipulation. What do you have? Forged surveys and intimidation tactics? Rourke's jaw tightened. You're playing a dangerous game, Miss Hale. No, Mr. Rourke. You're the one who's been playing games. We're just changing the rules. The tension stretched taut between them, and Ethan felt his hand drift toward the rifle secured to his saddle. Rourke's men noticed the movement and shifted in their seats, hands moving closer to their own weapons. Gentlemen, Martha Dawson's voice cut through the standoff. She emerged from behind the smokehouse, where she'd apparently been waiting after the earlier meeting. Seems like this conversation's getting a bit heated. Maybe you should continue it in front of the judge, like Miss Hale suggested. Tom Dawson appeared from the other direction, rifle casually cradled in his arms. That seems fair, legal and proper. Rourke looked between them, reassessing the situation. What he'd expected to be an isolated intimidation visit had turned into something else entirely. "This isn't over," Rourke said, pulling his horse around. "You think gathering a few desperate ranchers will protect you? You have no idea what you're up against." "Neither do you," Lydia replied quietly. Rourke and his men rode off into the gathering darkness, and Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "That was well done," Tom said, approaching them. "You stood your ground without escalating to violence." "He'll escalate soon enough," Ethan replied. "Men like Rourke don't back down from challenges." "Then we'd better be ready," Martha said. She looked at Lydia with approval. "You've got fire in you, girl. That's good. You're going to need it." After the Dawsons left, Ethan and Lydia returned to the house. The confrontation with Rourke had shaken them both, making the danger of their situation undeniable. "He's going to come after us harder now," Ethan said, staring into the fireplace. "I know." Lydia sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "But we expected that. Did we? Or did we just hope we could avoid direct conflict?" "Ethan," Lydia took his hand, "we passed avoiding conflict the moment we decided to fight back. Now we see it through. And if we lose, then we lose together," she said simply. "But I don't plan on losing." Over the next 2 weeks, their coalition grew stronger. More ranchers came forward with stories of Rourke's intimidation and fraudulent claims. Lydia documented everything, building a case so thorough that even Rourke's expensive lawyers would struggle to dismiss it. The lumber Ethan had ordered arrived, and work began on the new barn. Tom Dawson showed up with his sons to help, and Frank Cooper brought his boys as well. What had started as Ethan's personal battle became a community effort, with ranchers taking turns helping rebuild while others kept watch for Rourke's men. The barn rose slowly but steadily, each beam and board a defiant statement that they weren't giving up. Lydia worked alongside the men, hauling lumber and driving nails with the same determination she'd shown on the cattle drive. One evening, as they took a break from construction, Frank Cooper pulled Ethan aside. "I owe you an apology," Frank said. "When you first called that meeting, I thought you were just angry and looking for someone to blame. I didn't realize you actually had a plan." "That's Lydia's doing," Ethan said, watching her discuss carpentry techniques with one of Tom's sons. "She's the one who turned anger into strategy." "She's something special," Frank agreed. "You planning to make this partnership permanent?" Ethan felt heat rise in his face. "We've talked about it." Frank laughed. "That's rancher for yes, but I'm too stubborn to say it outright. Listen, Cade, don't wait too long to make things official. Women like her don't come along often, and Montana's a hard place to find happiness. When you do, you hold on to it." The advice settled into Ethan's chest, mixing with feelings he'd been trying to organize for weeks. He and Lydia had committed to partnership, to staying together, but they hadn't talked about marriage. The original mail-order arrangement seemed almost laughable now, a formal contract between strangers versus what they'd become through shared struggle and mutual respect. That night, after everyone had left and they were cleaning up the construction site, Ethan found himself watching Lydia work. She'd changed so much from the woman who'd stepped off the stagecoach 30-some days ago. Her hands were calloused now, her skin tanned from constant sun exposure. She moved with confidence, comfortable in work clothes and boots, her hair pulled back in a practical braid. But it was more than physical changes. There was a strength in her now that went beyond capability, a certainty that she belonged here, that she'd earned her place through sweat and determination. "You're staring," Lydia said without looking up from the lumber she was organizing. "Just thinking." "About?" Ethan set down his hammer. "About how different you are from what I expected." "Disappointed?" There was a hint of challenge in her voice. "Amazed," he said honestly. "I expected someone who'd need protecting, who'd require constant help and reassurance. Instead, you've been protecting me, helping me, making me stronger." Lydia finally looked at him, her expression softening. "Partnership works both ways, Ethan. You've given me purpose, challenged me to be stronger than I knew I could be. We've made each other better." "Is that enough?" Ethan asked. "Partnership and making each other better?" "What are you really asking?" Ethan took a breath. I'm asking if you'd consider making this permanent. Not just the ranch partnership, but everything. Marriage, building a life together, facing whatever comes next as a family instead of just business associates. Lydia was quiet for a long moment, and Ethan felt panic rise in his chest. He'd misread the situation, asked too much too soon, pushed for something she wasn't ready for. Then she smiled. I thought you'd never ask. Relief and joy flooded through him in equal measure. Is that a yes? That's a yes, Lydia confirmed. Though I have conditions. Of course you do. We marry as equals, she said firmly. Not as master and servant, not as man and dependent wife, but as true partners. What we build together. Decisions we make together. This ranch belongs to both of us, in law and in practice. Agreed, Ethan said without hesitation. And, Lydia continued, stepping closer, when we have children, and I do want children, we raise them to be strong, independent, and capable of fighting their own battles, just like we're doing now. I wouldn't have it any other way. Lydia reached up and touched the scar on his jaw, the one he'd carried since the war. You're sure about this? I'm not an easy woman, Ethan. I argue, I challenge, I refuse to be quiet when I think you're wrong. I know, Ethan said, covering her hand with his own. That's exactly why I want to marry you. They kissed then, sealing the promise with more certainty than any formal ceremony could provide. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. We should probably wait until after we deal with Rourke, Lydia said practically. Getting married in the middle of a legal battle seems unwise. Probably, Ethan agreed. But I'm holding you to this. Good, because I'm not going anywhere. The territorial judge arrived in Silver Ridge 3 weeks later, and the town hall was packed with ranchers, townspeople, and Rourke's lawyers. Judge Samuel Morrison was a stern man in his 60s who'd spent 30 years settling disputes across Montana territory. He listened to opening statements from both sides with an expression that gave nothing away. Rourke's lead attorney, a slick man named Thornton, presented their case first. He argued that the Territorial Land Company had legitimate claims to disputed properties based on official surveys and legal precedent. He painted the ranchers as squatters, trying to steal land that rightfully belonged to his clients. Then it was their turn. Lydia stood before the judge, her voice clear and confident as she laid out their case. She presented the ledger documenting 14 separate fraudulent claims, each one backed by witness testimony and physical evidence. She showed how Rourke's surveys contradicted official territorial records. She demonstrated a pattern of intimidation, property destruction, and legal manipulation that went back 3 years. Your Honor, Lydia concluded, this isn't a dispute between legitimate land claimants. This is systematic fraud designed to steal property from hard-working people who've built their lives here. We ask that you order a full investigation into the Territorial Land Company's practices and halt all boundary claims until that investigation is complete. Judge Morrison studied the documents Lydia had presented, his expression thoughtful. Mr. Thornton, these are serious allegations. How do you respond? Thornton stood, confident despite the evidence stacked against him. Your Honor, Miss Hale has presented an impressive collection of grievances, but grievances aren't proof. The Territorial Land Company has operated within the law. Have they? The judge held up one of the survey documents. Because this survey is dated March 15, 1873, and signed by Territorial Surveyor James Blackwood. But according to records from the Territorial Office, James Blackwood was in Helena that entire month, testifying in a separate land case. He couldn't have conducted this survey. Thornton's confidence faltered. That must be a clerical error. And this one? Morrison held up another document. Claims a boundary line running through Tom Dawson's property was established in 1871, but the Territorial Land Office has no record of any survey being requested or conducted on that property until 1873. Someone want to explain how a boundary was established 2 years before it was surveyed? The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Rourke, sitting behind his lawyer, remained stone-faced, but Ethan could see the calculation in his eyes. Your Honor, Thornton tried again, even if there are irregularities in some documents, irregularities? Morrison's voice cut like a knife. Mr. Thornton, what I'm seeing isn't irregularities, it's fraud. Systematic, deliberate fraud designed to steal property from citizens of this territory. He stood, and the room fell silent. I'm ordering an immediate halt to all land claims by the Territorial Land Company pending a full federal investigation. Any properties currently in dispute will remain with their current occupants until proper, verified surveys can be conducted. And I'm referring this case to the Territorial Marshal for potential criminal prosecution. The courtroom exploded in reaction, ranchers cheering, Rourke's men looking shocked, Thornton frantically gathering papers. Through it all, Ethan felt Lydia's hand slip into his, squeezing tight. They'd won. But victory in a courtroom and victory in the valley were two different things, and Ethan knew it the moment he saw Victor Rourke's face as they filed out of the town hall. The man's expression was carved from stone, but his eyes burned with a fury that promised retribution. "Watch your back, Cade," one of Rourke's men muttered as they passed, voice low enough that the celebrating ranchers wouldn't hear. The judge's ruling don't mean nothing if you're not around to enforce it. Ethan felt Lydia stiffen beside him, but before he could respond, Tom Dawson stepped between them and Rourke's man, his weathered face set hard. "That sounded like a threat, friend," Tom said quietly. "And making threats in front of witnesses after losing a court case is a good way to end up in a cell. So why don't you and your boss ride on back to wherever you came from before somebody decides to mention that conversation to the marshal?" Rourke's man glared but said nothing, turning away to follow his employer out of the building. The ranchers who'd gathered to support the case watched them go, their celebration muted by the unspoken understanding that the fight wasn't over. "He's not going to let this stand," Frank Cooper said once Rourke and his men had disappeared down the street. "Men like that don't lose gracefully." "Then we stay vigilant," Lydia replied, though Ethan could hear the tension beneath her calm tone. "We've proven he's operating outside the law. If he retaliates now, he'll face federal prosecution." "If we're alive to testify," one of the Harrison brothers muttered. The words cast a shadow over the group, reminding them all that legal victory meant nothing if Rourke decided to settle matters through violence instead of courts. That night, as they rode back to the ranch, Ethan and Lydia barely spoke. The weight of what they'd accomplished and what might still come pressed down on both of them like an approaching storm. When they finally reached home, the partially rebuilt barn stood silhouetted against the moonlight, a testament to their determination, but also a reminder of how easily everything could be destroyed. "We should set a watch," Ethan said as they unsaddled the horses, "at least for the next few weeks until things settle." "Agreed." Lydia's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she removed her horse's bridle. "I'll take first shift." "Lydia, don't argue with me about this, Ethan. I can handle a rifle just as well as you can, and you need rest. You've barely slept in 3 days preparing for that hearing." She was right, though Ethan hated admitting it. The exhaustion that had been held at bay by nervous energy during the trial now crashed over him like a wave. He nodded reluctantly and headed into the house, while Lydia settled herself on the porch with a rifle across her lap and a blanket around her shoulders. He tried to sleep but found himself staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak of the house, every distant sound that might signal danger. Finally, around midnight, he gave up and went downstairs to find Lydia still on watch, her eyes scanning the darkness beyond the ranch buildings. "Can't sleep?" she asked without looking at him. "Kept thinking about all the ways Rourke might come at us." Ethan sat beside her on the porch steps. "Fire again. Stampeding the cattle, cutting fences and letting the herd scatter, hiring men to ambush us on the trail." "I've been thinking the same things," Lydia admitted, "which is why I've been making a list." Of course she had. Ethan felt a smile tug at his lips despite the circumstances. A list of potential attacks? And countermeasures. She showed him the small notebook she'd been writing in. "If he tries fire again, we need water barrels positioned around all the buildings and a bell system to alert everyone quickly. If he goes after the cattle, we need riders checking the herd more frequently and better fencing on the vulnerable pastures. If he tries direct violence, we need witnesses and documentation ready to bring charges immediately." Ethan studied the neat handwriting, the careful consideration of each scenario and response. "You're planning for a war." "We're already in one," Lydia replied. "The courtroom was just the first battle. Now comes the siege." She was right again, and Ethan felt a surge of gratitude that she was on his side. He couldn't imagine facing what was coming alone. Marry me, he said suddenly. Lydia looked at him, surprised. I already agreed to marry you. I know, but I mean now, tomorrow. Don't wait until this is over, because we don't know when that will be. Ethan took her hand. I want you to be my wife before whatever's coming arrives. I want that settled, official, real. That's the least romantic proposal I've ever heard, Lydia said, but she was smiling. I'm a rancher, not a poet. Lucky for you, I prefer honesty over poetry. She squeezed his hand. Yes, tomorrow. But we do it properly, at the church in Silver Ridge with witnesses, so there's no question about the legitimacy of our marriage or our partnership in this ranch. They rode into Silver Ridge at dawn and found the minister just finishing his breakfast. Reverend Thomas was an elderly man who'd married half the couples in the valley over the past 30 years, and he listened to their request with knowing eyes. Running from trouble or toward it, he asked. Toward it, Lydia answered. We want to face what's coming as a legally bound partnership. Smart thinking. Nothing protects a woman's property rights like a marriage contract, especially in Montana territory. He studied them both carefully. Though I suspect this is about more than legal protection. It is, Ethan confirmed, but the legal part matters too. Fair enough. Give me an hour to gather witnesses and prepare the church. Word spread quickly through Silver Ridge, and by mid-morning the small church was filled with ranchers and townspeople who'd come to support them. Tom and Martha Dawson stood as witnesses, along with Frank Cooper and his wife. Even the judge, still in town finishing paperwork from the trial, attended with an approving nod. The ceremony was simple and brief. Ethan stood in his best shirt, hastily cleaned that morning, and Lydia wore a dress she'd brought from Boston but never had occasion to use until now. When Reverend Thomas asked them to repeat their vows, Ethan felt the weight of the commitment settling into his bones. I, Ethan Cade, take you, Lydia Hale, as my lawfully wedded wife, to stand beside you as an equal partner in all things, to face hardship and triumph together, to build a life and legacy that honors the strength we've found in each other. Lydia's voice was equally steady as she repeated her vows. I, Lydia Hale, take you, Ethan Cade, as my lawfully wedded husband, to stand beside you as an equal partner in all things, to face hardship and triumph together, to build a life and legacy that honors the strength we've found in each other. The rings were simple silver bands that Ethan had purchased from the general store that morning, but when he slipped the ring onto Lydia's finger, it felt more binding than any elaborate jewelry could have been. By the power vested in me by Montana territory, I now pronounce you husband and wife, Reverend Thomas said with a smile. You may kiss your bride, Mr. Cade. Ethan did, and the small church erupted in applause and cheers. For one brief moment, surrounded by friends and sealed in a commitment that felt unshakable, Ethan allowed himself to believe that everything might actually work out. The moment shattered 2 hours later. They were riding back to the ranch, newly married and cautiously optimistic, when they saw the smoke. Not the massive pillar of a burning barn this time, but several smaller plumes rising from different points across the valley. That's the Harrison place, Lydia said, pointing to the nearest smoke. And that's Frank Cooper's ranch. Ethan felt cold fury wash through him. While they'd been in church getting married, while most of the valley's ranchers had been in Silver Ridge celebrating with them, Rourke had struck. They rode hard toward the Harrison ranch and found both brothers trying to fight a fire that had consumed their hay storage shed. The structure was already lost, but they were desperately throwing water on the surrounding buildings to keep the flames from spreading. Started about an hour ago, the older Harrison brother James said between coughs. We were just finishing morning chores when we smelled smoke. By the time we found it, the whole shed was blazing. Anyone see who started it? Ethan asked, though he already knew the answer. Saw 3 riders heading east right before we spotted the smoke, the younger brother Robert confirmed. Too far away to identify, but the timing was suspicious as hell. They helped the Harrisons contain the fire, then rode to Frank Cooper's place. The story was the same. A fire started while Frank and his family were in town, destroying winter feed and equipment. By the time they'd finished checking on all the ranchers who'd supported them in court, the pattern was clear. 5 ranches had been hit, each one losing critical supplies but nothing irreplaceable. It wasn't about total destruction this time. It was about sending a message. He's showing us he can hit us whenever he wants, Tom Dawson said that evening when the targeted ranchers gathered at Ethan's place. Doesn't matter that we won in court. Doesn't matter that the judge ordered an investigation. He's proving that the law can't protect us from him. The law will catch up to him eventually, Lydia insisted, though even she sounded less certain than before. We document these fires, report them to the marshal, build a case for arson, and in the meantime he burns us out one building at a time, Frank interrupted. I lost 3 months of stored feed today. The Harrisons lost more. We can rebuild, but how many times? How long before one of these fires spreads to a house with people inside? The question hung heavy in the air. They'd won a legal victory, but Rourke was showing them that legal victories meant nothing against a man willing to operate outside the law. So what do we do? Robert Harrison asked, looking at Ethan. Give up? Sell out and leave? No, Ethan said firmly, though he wasn't sure what alternative he could offer. We don't give up. Then what? James Harrison pressed. Because right now it feels like we're just waiting for him to burn us down one piece at a time. Lydia stood, her expression thoughtful. We changed tactics. Rourke's counting on us being isolated, spread across the valley in separate ranches that he can pick off individually. But what if we weren't isolated? What are you suggesting? Tom asked. A watch system. We organize patrols that cover all our properties, riders rotating between ranches, watching for suspicious activity, ready to sound the alarm if anything happens. Lydia pulled out her ever-present notebook and began sketching a map. We have 7 ranches in our alliance. If we coordinate properly, we can have eyes on every property most of the time. That's a lot of manpower, Frank said. We'd have to pull hands away from regular ranch work. It's better than losing everything to arson, Lydia countered. And if we're smart about the scheduling, we can minimize the disruption. She's right, Martha Dawson spoke up. We've been fighting as individuals. Maybe it's time we start thinking like a community. Over the next hour, they worked out the details. Each ranch would contribute riders for patrol duty, rotating shifts so no one place was left undefended. They'd use a bell system to signal danger, different patterns for fire, trespassers, or other threats. And they'd keep detailed logs of everything they observed, building evidence for when the marshal's investigation finally began. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was something. As the ranchers dispersed into the night, each heading home to implement the new watch system, Ethan felt cautiously hopeful that they might survive this after all. But Lydia remained troubled, staring at her notes long after everyone had left. What's wrong? Ethan asked. I'm trying to think like Rourke, she said. He's smart, ruthless, and adaptable. Today's fires were just a test, seeing how we'd react, measuring our defenses. Now that he knows we're organizing patrols, he'll adjust his strategy. To what? I don't know yet, but it'll be something we're not prepared for. She looked up at him, concern clear in her eyes. We need to think several moves ahead, anticipate what he might do before he does it. That's impossible. We can't predict. We can try. Lydia's voice took on the determined edge Ethan had learned to recognize. Rourke wants this land. The judge's ruling blocked his legal path to getting it, and our watch system is making his intimidation tactics harder. So what's his next move? Ethan thought about it, trying to put himself in Rourke's position. He could wait us out. Eventually, we'll make a mistake or let our guard down. Possible, but Rourke doesn't strike me as patient. The federal investigation will be starting soon. The longer this drags out, the more likely real evidence against him surfaces. Then he needs to either force us out quickly or discredit us before the investigation concludes, Ethan reasoned. Exactly. Lydia tapped her pencil against the notebook. So, how does he accomplish that? They spent the rest of the night theorizing, planning, trying to anticipate an enemy who'd already proven himself clever and ruthless. By dawn, they had contingency plans for a dozen different scenarios, though both knew that reality rarely followed neat predictions. The watch system went into effect the next day, with riders patrolling between ranches on rotating schedules. For the first week, nothing happened. The patrols saw no suspicious activity, no fires started, no fences cut. It was almost peaceful, which made Ethan more nervous than open conflict would have. He's waiting for something, Lydia said on the 8th day of quiet, building up to something bigger. She was right, though they didn't learn what until a rider came thundering up to the ranch at midday, his horse lathered and breathing hard. Mr. Cade, the young man, one of Frank Cooper's sons, practically fell off his horse. You need to come to Silver Ridge right now. The marshal's there, and he's asking questions about the fires. Good, Lydia said. That means the investigation is starting. No, ma'am, you don't understand. The boy was pale, frightened. He's not investigating Rourke. He's investigating you. Someone told him that you and the other ranchers started the fires yourselves to frame Rourke and steal his land claims. Ethan felt the ground shift beneath him. Of course. It was brilliant in its simplicity. Turn their own evidence against them, make them look like the criminals instead of the victims. They rode to Silver Ridge immediately and found the territorial marshal, a hard-faced man named Coleman, waiting in the sheriff's office with a stack of papers and a skeptical expression. Mr. and Mrs. Cade, Coleman said, emphasizing Lydia's new married name with subtle disapproval. I've been hearing some interesting allegations. Care to explain why multiple witnesses claim to have seen your ranch hands near the Harrison and Cooper properties right before the fire started? That's impossible, Ethan said. We were in church getting married when those fires started. Half the town was there. I'm aware of where you were, Coleman replied. I'm asking about your ranch hands. A man matching the description of your former employee, Coop, was spotted near 3 of the fire sites. Ethan's blood ran cold. Coop had left weeks ago to work in Helena, or at least that's what he'd said. Coop hasn't worked for us in over a month, Lydia said carefully, and I'd like to know who these witnesses are who claim to have seen him. Coleman consulted his papers. Anonymous reports, but corroborated by multiple sources. Anonymous reports paid for by Victor Rourke, Lydia shot back. Marshal, you're being used to discredit legitimate victims of arson and fraud. That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Cade. It's the truth. Rourke lost in court, so now he's trying to manipulate the law to his advantage. Lydia pulled out her ledger. We have documented evidence of his fraud going back 3 years. We have witness testimony from multiple ranchers. And now, conveniently, after we win our case, anonymous witnesses suddenly appear claiming we set our own fires? The timing is suspicious at best, manufactured at worst. Coleman was unmoved. The timing could also suggest desperation, ranchers losing in court, trying to frame a powerful man to salvage their claims. Marshal Coleman. Tom Dawson's voice came from the doorway. He'd arrived with Martha and several other ranchers who'd heard about the accusations. I've known Ethan Cade for 5 years. He's the most honest man in this valley. If he says he didn't start those fires, he didn't start them. Character references are appreciated, Mr. Dawson, but they aren't evidence. Then how about this for evidence, Lydia said, her voice sharp. Ethan's barn burned down weeks before any of the other fires. Are you suggesting he destroyed his own property, lost thousands of dollars in equipment and feed, risked his horses' lives, all as part of some elaborate scheme to frame Rourke? People do desperate things when they're facing financial ruin. We're not facing financial ruin. Lydia's eyes flashed with anger. We just returned from a successful cattle drive to the mining camps. We have the money to rebuild. We have no motive to destroy our own property or our neighbors. But Rourke has every motive to make us look like criminals before your investigation exposes his fraud. The marshal studied her for a long moment, and Ethan could see the calculation in his eyes. Coleman wasn't stupid. He could see the logic in Lydia's argument, but he was also a political creature, and going against a powerful man like Rourke carried risks. I'll need to interview all the ranchers involved, Coleman said finally, and I'll want to examine your financial records, verify your story about the mining camp sale. You're welcome to examine whatever you need, Lydia replied coolly. We have nothing to hide. The interviews took the rest of the day, with Coleman questioning each rancher separately about the fires, their relationship with Rourke, and their financial situations. Ethan and Lydia provided bank statements showing the mining camp profits, receipts for the lumber and supplies they'd purchased for rebuilding, and testimonies from merchants in Silver Ridge who could verify their transactions. By evening, Coleman's expression had shifted from skeptical to thoughtful. The evidence didn't support the narrative that the ranchers had started the fires themselves, but proving Rourke was behind it was another matter entirely. I'll continue investigating, Coleman said as the sun set, but I'll be looking at all possibilities, not just the ones you want me to see. It was the best they could hope for, though it left them vulnerable. Rourke had successfully muddied the waters, making them suspects instead of victims. Even if they were eventually cleared, the damage to their reputations would linger. As they rode home that night, Ethan felt the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. They'd fought in court and won. They'd organized the Valley's ranchers into a united front. They'd survived fires and intimidation and false accusations. But instead of getting easier, the fight seemed to grow more complex with each passing day. "We're losing ground," he said quietly. "No," Lydia replied, though her voice was tight with strain. "We're being tested. There's a difference." "Feels the same to me." "It's not." She pulled her horse closer to his, reaching across to take his hand. "Rourke's getting desperate. These accusations, the fires, all of it, they're the actions of a man who knows he's losing control. He's trying to break us before the federal investigation finds evidence that could land him in prison." "What if he succeeds?" Lydia was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that cut through Ethan's despair like a knife through fog. "Then we pick ourselves up and fight again. Because that's what we do, Ethan. We don't surrender. We don't break. We bend, we adapt, and we keep moving forward." She squeezed his hand. "I didn't survive losing my parents, fighting my family, and traveling 2,000 miles to build a new life just to let one ruthless man take it away. And neither did you." She was right. Ethan had survived a war, built a ranch from nothing, and found a partner who made him stronger than he'd ever been alone. He'd faced worse odds and come through intact. They could survive this too. When they reached the ranch, they found an unexpected visitor waiting on the porch. Coop sat on the steps, his hat in his hands, looking older and more worn than when he'd left. "Boss," Coop said, standing as they approached. "I heard about the marshal's accusations. Wanted to come set the record straight." "Where have you been?" Ethan asked, dismounting carefully. "Helena, like I said, working construction on the new bank building. Got 20 men who can verify I was there the day those fires started." Coop pulled out a folded paper. "Foreman gave me this. Statement confirming I've been working steady for the past month, never missed a day." Lydia took the paper and read it carefully. "This is exactly what we need. Thank you, Coop." "Also wanted to say congratulations on the wedding," Coop added with a small smile. "Heard it was quite the affair." "Brief but meaningful," Ethan replied. "Listen, Coop, I'm sorry you got pulled into this mess. Not your fault. Rourke's a bastard who'll use anyone to get what he wants." Coop shifted uncomfortably. "Truth is, I feel guilty for leaving when I did. Feels like running out on you during a fight." "You did what you needed to survive," Lydia said kindly. "No one faults you for that. Still, if you need an extra hand for the patrols or rebuilding, I could stay a while. Construction job will still be there next month." Ethan felt gratitude swell in his chest. "We could use the help, if you're sure." "I'm sure. Besides," Coop's expression hardened, "I'd like to see Rourke get what's coming to him. Man who'd lie about me to frame innocent people deserves whatever he gets." With Coop's testimony and documented alibi, the marshal's suspicions began to shift. Coleman couldn't ignore evidence that directly contradicted the anonymous accusations. Slowly, painfully, the investigation started focusing where it should have from the beginning, on Rourke and his organization. But the damage was done. The Valley's ranchers, once united in purpose, now looked at each other with subtle distrust. Accusations had been made, suspicions planted. Even those who believed in Ethan and Lydia's innocence couldn't shake the nagging doubt that Rourke had successfully introduced. "He's dividing us," Lydia observed one evening as they reviewed reports from the patrols. "Even without proof, the accusations are making people question their allies. How do we fight that?" "By proving we're stronger together than apart. By showing that trust and cooperation matter more than fear and suspicion." She looked at him with determination. "We need something that brings the community together again, reminds everyone why they joined this fight in the first place." The answer came from an unexpected source. The next morning, they received word that a massive storm was heading toward the valley. Early winter weather that could devastate unprepared ranches and trap cattle in dangerous conditions. It was the kind of crisis that had destroyed operations before, the kind that turned careful planning into desperate survival. And it gave them exactly the opportunity Lydia had been looking for. Within hours of the storm warning, Lydia had organized a plan that was as ambitious as it was necessary. She rode from ranch to ranch with Ethan, explaining her proposal to every member of their coalition and several ranchers who'd remain neutral in the conflict with Rourke. The storm's going to hit hardest in the northern pastures, she told each group. Cattle will try to drift south looking for shelter, and if they get caught in the open when the temperature drops, we'll lose hundreds of head across the valley. But if we work together, pooling our riders, coordinating our efforts, moving the herds to protected areas before the storm arrives, we can save most of them. That's asking a lot, one of the neutral ranchers said, a man named Peterson who'd avoided taking sides throughout the legal battle. My cattle, my responsibility. Why should I risk my men helping others? Because next time it might be your ranch that needs help, Lydia replied. And because cattle don't respect property lines. If your neighbor loses his herd and goes under, that's one less buyer for your breeding stock, one less hand to help with spring roundup, one less family supporting the businesses in Silver Ridge that you depend on. It was a practical argument, stripped of emotion or appeals to charity, and it worked. By evening, they'd organized 23 ranchers into a coordinated effort, the largest cooperative action the valley had ever seen. The storm was 12 hours away when they began moving cattle. Ethan led a team of 8 riders into the high country where his herd grazed, pushing 300 head toward the protected valley near his ranch buildings. The work was brutal and cold, with wind already picking up and the temperature dropping steadily. Lydia coordinated from the central meeting point they'd established at the Dawson Ranch, tracking which herds had been moved, which ranchers needed additional help, and where riders should be deployed next. She'd transformed Martha Dawson's kitchen table into a command center, with maps marked with cattle positions, rider assignments, and shelter locations. Harrison Brothers need 3 more riders, Tom Dawson reported, arriving with an update. Their herd scattered into the canyon, and they can't round them up alone before the storm hits. Send Cooper's oldest boy and the 2 hands from the Miller Ranch, Lydia said without hesitation, checking her notes. They finished moving Miller's herd an hour ago and are closest to the canyon. You've got the whole valley mapped in your head, don't you? Martha observed with admiration. Just organized on paper, Lydia replied, though her eyes were bright with the intensity of managing so many moving pieces. We lose track of one group, and people could die in this storm. By midnight, most of the cattle had been moved to sheltered locations, but the work was far from over. The storm hit just after 1 in the morning, arriving with howling wind and snow that fell so thick it was impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Temperature plummeted to dangerous levels, and the riders still out in the weather faced real risk of freezing. Ethan was bringing in the last group of stragglers when his horse stumbled in a hidden gully, throwing him hard against frozen ground. Pain shot through his left arm, and when he tried to push himself up, it wouldn't bear weight properly. Broken or badly sprained, he couldn't tell in the darkness and cold. "Boss!" Coop appeared through the snow, dismounting quickly. "You all right?" "Arm's bad," Ethan managed through gritted teeth. "But the cattle!" "I'll get them in. You need to get to shelter before you freeze." Ethan wanted to argue, but the pain and cold were already making him lightheaded. He let Coop help him onto his horse and rode slowly back toward the ranch, cradling his injured arm against his chest. He found the ranch house transformed into an emergency shelter. At least 15 people crowded inside. Ranchers and riders who'd been caught by the storm's early arrival and couldn't make it back to their own places. Lydia had organized everything with characteristic efficiency. Hot coffee brewing, blankets distributed, wet clothes drying by the fire. She saw him immediately and pushed through the crowd, her face going pale when she noticed how he was holding his arm. What happened? Horse stumbled. "I'm fine." But even as he said it, the room tilted slightly. Lydia got him to a chair and examined his arm with careful, gentle hands. "It's broken. We need to set it before the swelling gets worse." "You know how to set broken bones?" one of the ranchers asked, surprised. "I read a book," Lydia said absently, already gathering supplies. "Martha, I need wooden splints, clean cloth for binding, and whiskey for sterilization." "The whiskeys for sterilization?" Ethan asked with a weak smile. "Some of it. The rest is for you to drink." She met his eyes, and he saw the fear beneath her calm exterior. "This is going to hurt." It did. Lydia worked quickly and competently, setting the bone with Martha's help while two ranchers held Ethan steady. The pain was excruciating, but when it was over, his arm was properly splinted and bound. "Where did you really learn to do that?" Ethan asked when he could breathe normally again. "I told you, I read a medical manual before leaving Boston." Lydia wiped sweat from her forehead despite the cold. "I also practiced on chicken bones until I could set them properly, because I knew frontier life would be dangerous, and I refused to be helpless." Even through the pain, Ethan felt love swell in his chest for this extraordinary woman who'd prepared for every possibility and refused to be defeated by any of them. The storm raged for 2 days. During that time, the ranch house became a refuge for stranded riders and ranchers who couldn't reach their own homes. Lydia managed the crowded space with the same efficiency she'd shown managing the cattle movement, rationing food, organizing sleeping shifts, and keeping everyone's spirits up despite the dangerous conditions outside. Stories were shared during those long hours trapped inside. Frank Cooper talked about losing his first wife to cholera and how close he'd come to giving up ranching entirely. The Harrison brothers admitted they'd considered selling out to Rourke before Lydia and Ethan had organized the coalition. Peterson, the neutral rancher who'd been skeptical about helping, confessed that he'd been saved from bankruptcy 5 years ago when his neighbors helped rebuild after a fire. "That's what we used to do out here," Peterson said, staring into his coffee. "Help each other survive because the frontier was hard enough without fighting amongst ourselves. Somewhere along the way, we forgot that. Started thinking every man had to stand alone, or he wasn't really a man." "Rourke counted on that thinking," Lydia said quietly. "He needed us isolated to pick us off one by one. But this storm reminded us of something important. We're stronger together." When the storm finally broke on the third morning, the valley emerged into a landscape transformed by snow and ice. Ethan, his arm still splinted but healing, rode out with the others to assess the damage. They found cattle huddled in the sheltered areas where they'd been moved, cold and hungry, but alive. A few had been lost, caught in the open despite their best efforts, but the numbers were far lower than they would have been without the coordinated rescue effort. More importantly, the ranchers who'd worked together during the crisis had forged bonds that suspicion and accusation couldn't easily break. They'd saved each other's livelihoods, trusted each other in life and death situations, and proven that cooperation worked better than isolation. "Rourke's gonna hate this," Coop observed as they watched ranchers from different properties working together to clear snow and check on livestock. "Nothing threatens a man like him more than people who won't fight each other." He was right. The unified response to the storm had accomplished what legal arguments and evidence couldn't. It had transformed the valley's scattered ranchers into a genuine community with shared interests and mutual trust. The counterattack came a week later, but it wasn't what anyone expected. Ethan was in Silver Ridge picking up medical supplies when he saw the crowd gathered outside the land office. Marshal Coleman stood on the steps with several federal investigators, and the expressions on their faces told him something significant had happened. "We've completed our investigation into the Territorial Land Company's practices," Coleman announced, his voice carrying across the crowd. "We found extensive evidence of fraud, including forged survey documents, falsified territorial records, and bribery of local officials. Warrants have been issued for the arrest of Victor Rourke and 3 of his associates on charges of conspiracy to commit fraud, arson, and intimidation." The crowd erupted in reaction, some cheering, some shocked, all buzzing with the significance of the announcement. "Where's Rourke now?" someone called out. Coleman's expression darkened. "That's the problem. Mr. Rourke appears to have fled the territory. We've issued warrants to neighboring territories and states, but as of now, his location is unknown." Ethan felt conflicting emotions surge through him. Victory that the legal system had finally recognized Rourke's crimes, but frustration that the man himself had escaped justice. He found Lydia at the general store, and her reaction mirrored his own. "He ran," she said, processing the news. "He knew the investigation was closing in and fled rather than face trial." "Does that bother you?" Ethan asked. "That he got away?" Lydia considered the question carefully. "Yes and no. I wanted to see him face consequences for what he did, but more than that, I wanted him stopped. And he is stopped. His land company is being dissolved, his fraudulent claims are being reversed, and he can never operate in Montana territory again without being arrested. That's not perfect justice, but it's enough. Enough to rebuild? Enough to rebuild, she confirmed. The barn raising happened 2 weeks later, and it became a celebration of more than just construction. Every rancher in the valley showed up, not just those who'd been part of the coalition, but neutrals like Peterson, and even a few who'd been openly skeptical of Ethan and Lydia's fight against Rourke. They brought lumber, tools, food, and labor. The new barn rose quickly, with so many hands working together, larger and stronger than the one that had burned. Tom Dawson supervised the framing while Frank Cooper organized the roofing teams. The Harrison brothers worked on the interior stalls, and Peterson donated hardware from his own supplies. Lydia moved through the organized chaos, coordinating efforts and making sure everyone had what they needed. She'd come so far from the uncertain woman who'd stepped off the stagecoach months ago. Now she commanded respect not through force, but through competence and genuine care for the community they'd built together. By sunset, the barn stood complete, a testament to what could be accomplished when people work toward common goals instead of tearing each other down. As the workers gathered for a celebratory meal prepared by the valley's ranch wives, Tom Dawson raised his cup in a toast. "To Ethan and Lydia Cade," he said, his voice carrying across the crowd, "who reminded us that strength isn't just about surviving alone. Sometimes the greatest victories come from choosing to stand, fight, and build a future side by side." The crowd cheered, and Ethan felt Lydia's hand slip into his, squeezing tight. They'd survived fires, storms, legal battles, and a ruthless enemy. They'd built something far greater than just a ranch. They'd built a community that refused to let any member stand alone. The territorial judge returned 3 months later to finalize the legal proceedings. With Rourke gone and his organization disbanded, the process was straightforward. All fraudulent land claims were nullified, disputed properties were returned to their rightful owners, and the valley's ranchers received official confirmation of their legal rights to land they'd worked for years. But the real victory wasn't in the legal documents. It was in the cooperative that Lydia had organized, a formal association of valley ranchers who pooled resources, shared information, and supported each other through challenges. They negotiated better prices at market by selling cattle collectively. They purchased supplies in bulk to reduce costs. They maintained the patrol and watch systems that had protected them during the conflict with Rourke, not because they expected new threats, but because it made sense to look out for each other. The association grew beyond the original coalition members to include nearly every rancher in the valley. They elected officers, Tom Dawson as president, Frank Cooper as treasurer, and Lydia as secretary, a role that let her put her organizational skills to use for the entire community. "You've built something remarkable," Reverend Thomas told Lydia one Sunday after services, "not just for yourselves, but for everyone in this valley." "We just showed people what was possible," Lydia replied modestly. "They did the work themselves." "Don't sell yourself short, Mrs. Cade. Leadership is recognizing what needs to be done and giving people the tools to do it. That's exactly what you've done." Winter came again, but this time the Cade Ranch was prepared. The new barn stood strong and secure, filled with winter feed purchased collectively through the association at reduced prices. The cattle were healthy and well managed. The fence lines were solid, repaired and reinforced by neighbors who'd pitched in during slow days. Ethan stood at the fence one cold December afternoon, watching snow fall gently across the valley. His arm had healed completely, though it still ached in cold weather, a permanent reminder of the storm that had united the valley. Lydia appeared beside him, wrapped in a warm coat, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "Penny, for your thoughts?" she asked. "Just thinking about how different things are from a year ago," Ethan said, "when I rode to that stage stop expecting a quiet, forgettable mail-order bride." Lydia laughed. "Sorry to disappoint. You did the opposite of disappoint." He pulled her close, feeling her warmth against him. "You saved this ranch, built a community, and gave me a future I didn't think was possible." "We did those things together," Lydia corrected. "That's the whole point, isn't it? Neither of us could have done this alone." She was right, as usual. Alone, Ethan would have lost the ranch to Rourke or to his own stubborn isolation. Alone, Lydia would never have found the strength to challenge men who'd tried to control her life. Together, they'd become something greater than the sum of their individual capabilities. "I have news," Lydia said, and something in her tone made Ethan look at her carefully. She was smiling, but there was nervous excitement in her eyes. "I wasn't sure when to tell you, but it seems appropriate now, with everything settled." "What kind of news?" "The kind that means we should probably add a nursery to the house before next summer." She placed his hand on her stomach. "You're going to be a father, Ethan." For a moment, Ethan couldn't breathe. A child. Their child. Another generation to carry on what they'd built, to grow up in a valley where people supported each other instead of tearing each other down. "Are you sure?" he managed finally. "Martha confirmed it last week. She's delivered half the babies in this valley, so I trust her diagnosis." Lydia's smile widened at his stunned expression. "You're happy about this, right? I know we haven't talked much about children, and with everything that's happened," Ethan kissed her, cutting off the nervous rambling. When they finally pulled apart, he was grinning so widely his face hurt. "I'm happy," he said. "Happier than I've been in my entire life." They stood there in the falling snow, planning a future that felt secure for the first time since Ethan had started the ranch. They'd need to expand the house, prepare for sleepless nights, and all the chaos that came with children. But they'd face those challenges the same way they'd faced everything else, together, as equal partners building something that would outlast them both. Spring arrived with the usual burst of activity: calving season, fence repairs, preparing for the summer grazing. But this year felt different. The valley's ranchers worked with confidence born from having survived genuine threats and emerged stronger. The cooperative was running smoothly, providing benefits that individual ranchers could never have achieved alone. Lydia's pregnancy progressed through the spring and into summer. She remained active in the cooperative's operations, though she'd delegated more of the physical work to others. The valley's ranch wives rallied around her with advice, hand-sewn baby clothes, and the kind of support that came from genuine community. The baby arrived on a warm July evening, a healthy boy with Ethan's strong features and Lydia's determined expression. They named him Thomas, after Tom Dawson, who'd been the first to support their fight against Rourke and had become like family over the past year. "He's perfect," Martha Dawson said, examining the newborn with experienced eyes. "And he's got strong lungs. You'll have no trouble hearing him when he wants attention." As if to prove her point, Thomas let out a wail that echoed through the ranch house. Ethan, who'd faced down enemy soldiers, stampeding cattle, and ruthless land barons without flinching, felt completely overwhelmed by the tiny human in his arms. "What do I do?" he asked Lydia helplessly. "You learn," she said with a tired smile. "Same way we learned everything else, by doing it, making mistakes, and figuring it out together." The first year of Thomas's life was chaotic and exhausting and wonderful. Ethan learned to function on interrupted sleep, to change diapers with one hand while managing ranch work with the other, to balance the demands of fatherhood with the responsibilities of running an operation. Lydia proved as capable at motherhood as she was at everything else, though she insisted on maintaining her role in the cooperative. She attended meetings with Thomas strapped to her chest, nursed him while reviewing account books, and somehow managed to keep the entire valley organized while raising an infant. "I don't know how you do it," Frank Cooper's wife admitted during one cooperative meeting. "Managing all this with a baby." "I have help," Lydia said simply, nodding toward Ethan, who was currently walking Thomas around the room to keep him from fussing during the proceedings. Partnership means sharing everything: the work, the responsibilities, the challenges. "I couldn't do this alone, but I don't have to." The cooperative continued to grow and evolve. They built a shared storage facility in Silver Ridge, where members could keep equipment and supplies. They organized seasonal work parties where ranchers rotated helping each other with major projects. They even started a lending system where ranchers in temporary financial difficulty could borrow from the cooperative's collective funds at fair terms, avoiding the predatory lending that had destroyed operations in the past. 2 years after Rourke's flight from the territory, word reached them that he'd been arrested in California for attempting similar fraud schemes there. He'd face trial and likely prison, though by then it mattered less to the valley's ranchers. They'd moved beyond simply stopping one man. They'd built a system that would protect against anyone who tried similar tactics in the future. The Cade Ranch prospered. With the barn rebuilt and the cooperative providing support during difficult seasons, Ethan expanded the operation to 500 head of cattle. He hired additional hands, including several young men from valley families who wanted to learn ranching. The place that had once been a lonely outpost became a thriving operation that trained the next generation. Thomas grew from infant to toddler to a bright, curious 4-year-old who loved following his father around the ranch and asking endless questions. Ethan taught him to ride, to recognize different breeds of cattle, to understand the rhythms of ranch life. Lydia taught him to read and write, to solve problems through thinking rather than force, to value community and cooperation. "He's going to be formidable," Tom Dawson observed one afternoon, watching Thomas organize a group of ranchers' children into a game that somehow involved cattle brands and territorial surveys. Got his mother's brain and his father's determination. "That's a dangerous combination," Ethan agreed, but he was smiling. On the 5th anniversary of Lydia's arrival in Silver Ridge, the cooperative organized a celebration. It had grown to include 32 ranches, making it the largest such organization in Montana Territory. They'd successfully lobbied for better territorial representation, improved roads to market, and legal protections for small landowners. The celebration took place at the new community hall the cooperative had built, a large structure that served as a meeting place, social center, and emergency shelter when needed. Nearly 200 people attended, representing every family in the valley and several from neighboring regions who'd heard about their success. Ethan stood at the front of the hall with Lydia beside him and Thomas between them, looking out at the crowd of people who'd become more than just neighbors. They were family in the truest sense, bound not by blood, but by shared struggle, mutual support, and genuine care for each other's well-being. "When I came here 5 years ago," Lydia said when called upon to speak, "I was looking for a fresh start. What I found was so much more than that. I found a partner who challenged me to be stronger. I found a community that proved cooperation beats competition. And I found a purpose, helping build something that will outlast all of us." She paused, looking around the hall at faces young and old, established ranchers and newcomers, people who'd supported them from the beginning, and those who'd joined later. "This cooperative isn't just about ranching or legal protection or better prices at market," Lydia continued. "It's about recognizing that we're all connected, that one person's success doesn't require another's failure, that the strongest communities are built when everyone has a stake in each other's well-being. What we've created here, it's a model for how people can live together on the frontier without destroying each other in the process." The crowd applauded, and Ethan felt pride swell in his chest. His wife, this remarkable woman who'd arrived on a stagecoach with nothing but a trunk and determination, had fundamentally changed how an entire valley thought about community and cooperation. Later that evening, after the celebration had wound down and they'd returned home, Ethan and Lydia stood on their porch watching the sun set over the mountains. Thomas was asleep inside, worn out from playing with the other children. The ranch was quiet except for the distant sound of cattle and the evening wind. "Do you ever regret it?" Ethan asked. "Leaving Boston, coming to Montana, tying yourself to a stubborn rancher, and all the chaos that came with it?" Lydia leaned against him, comfortable and content. "Not once, not even on the hardest days." She looked up at him. "Do you regret writing that letter? Taking a chance on a mail-order bride who turned out to be far more complicated than you expected?" "Best decision I ever made," Ethan said honestly. "Even when you're arguing with me, challenging my plans, reorganizing my entire operation." "Especially then," Lydia corrected with a smile. They stood there in comfortable silence, watching darkness settle over the valley they'd fought so hard to protect and build. The barn stood strong against the evening sky. The cattle grazed peacefully in protected pastures. The cooperative's influence extended across the region, creating stability and prosperity that individual effort never could have achieved. But more than the physical accomplishments, more than the legal victories or financial success, they'd created something intangible but infinitely valuable, a legacy of partnership, cooperation, and refusing to surrender in the face of overwhelming odds. "What do you think Thomas will remember about all this?" Lydia asked. "When he's grown and running this ranch himself?" "I think he'll remember that his parents fought for what they believed in," Ethan said, "that they built something worth protecting, and that they proved strength doesn't come from standing alone. It comes from choosing the right people to stand beside." "That's a good legacy," Lydia agreed. As stars began appearing in the darkening sky, they turned and went inside together, ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring. The frontier was still hard, Montana winters were still brutal, and running a ranch still required backbreaking work and constant vigilance. But they'd proven something the frontier rarely acknowledged, that sometimes the greatest victories came not from conquering the land or defeating enemies, but from choosing to build a future side by side with people who refused to let you fall. And in that choice, in that partnership, they'd found something more valuable than any amount of land or cattle or legal victories. They'd found home.